Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Richard Gibson and welcome to this presentation on the Cryonic refugee appropriate analogy or confusing rhetoric. This work explores whether those who undergo cryopreservation to circumvent death can be thought to be analogous to contemporary refugees. The presentation proceeds chiefly in two parts. Firstly, an account of what critical conditions need to be present for an individual to be considered a refugee in the typical sense will be given. Second, these essential criteria will be compared to the phenomena of cryopreservation to see what these two groups share and whether the cryonic refugee conceptualization is appropriate. So, the best place to start is with an introduction and some points of clarification. Cryonics is the practice of freezing someone at or just after the point of death to prevent decay and preserve that individual's structure until it becomes feasible to revive them. Typically considered the preserve of science fiction, James Bedford became the first cryon in 1967. His still preserved body now resides with Arizona's Alcor Life Extension Foundation. While being the globe's largest cryopreservation company, Alcor is not on its own. The Cryonics Institute, Oregon Cryonics, CryoRus, and the Shandong Yinfeng Life Science Research Institute all offer similar amenities. Even NASA and the ESA are investigating cryonics as a means of facilitating space exploration. Currently, there are between 350 to 500 cryons worldwide, with several thousand people registered through various agencies to undergo the procedure when they die. The practice is predicated upon three premises. 1. That life can be paused and unpaused if its fundamental structure is sufficiently preserved. 2. That chemical agents enable the extreme cooling of the body, conserving the brain's structure. And 3. That future medical developments can facilitate restoration. In both instances, high-fidelity conservation of the brain structure is the primary goal. And, while no one's been successfully revived yet, with hundreds of people having undergone the procedure and thousands more planning to, research into the practice is essential. One particular thorny question concerns what, if anything, a future society owes those who have undergone cryonic preservation. What does a future society owe to the recently revived in terms of assistance and care, especially if they lack the means of supporting themselves? Now, one method of understanding whether such a responsibility exists is through analogous reasoning. One particularly popular analogy conceptualizes those who undergo cryopreservation as what I've dubbed cryonic refugees. As postulated by Sandberg, people who want to be cryopreserved are like refugees from the present, fleeing to the future because they can't survive here. The difference between contemporary and cryonic refugees is that while the former flees spatially, i.e. they move geographically, the latter flees temporally, i.e. they move through time. While this produces powerful imagery, whether the analogy between the two groups is appropriate hasn't been fully explored, hence why I'm doing this piece of work here. To understand whether the conceptualization works, we first need a solid grasp on what exactly constitutes a contemporary refugee. In international law, the UN's 1951 Refugee Convention and its accompanying 1967 protocol endorse a single definition of the term refugee. Accordingly, the term refugee applies to anyone who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, as a result of such events, is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. Taking this definition as the standard, 4 central elements are necessary for an individual to be correctly identified as a refugee. 1. That person no longer resides in their country of origin. 2. That person is unable to return to their country of origin. 3. That person is unable to avail themselves of the protection of their point of origin due to a credible fear of persecution. And 4. The nature of the trait causing persecution is intimate, closely integrated to that person's identity, and is something that can reasonably be expected to be expressed without persecution. Suppose one could identify these 4 traits in the cryons ontology. In that case, a convincing argument could be made for the appropriateness of the cryonic refugee's conceptualization. From this claim, an argument could then be launched for the protections afforded contemporary refugees to be applicable to cryonic refugees, protections granted by both international instruments and state-based complementary protections. However, as will be discovered, the work required to convert these criteria into a form that would apply to a cryon is considerable. Nevertheless, let's crack on and deliberately go through the 4 criteria, starting with whether a cryon no longer resides in their country of origin. The first thing that needs acknowledging is a necessary adjustment to this theme's focus. Those who undergo cryopreservation do so as a means of transitioning from one period to another. This temporal aspect is central here. Of course, a cryon could travel spatially while preserved, but this would be in addition to the central purpose of the practice, not intrinsic to it. While it makes sense that the contemporary definition of a refugee centres on the point of geography, to understand whether this theme can apply to the case of a cryon, an alteration is needed. Specifically, to phrase it in terms of the 1951 Convention, rather than reading as that person no longer resides in their country of origin, the theme would need to be altered to that person no longer resides in their period of origin. Thus, the question becomes, does a cryon no longer reside in their original era? The answer to this depends on the length of preservation. Contemporary refugees traverse geographical distances to move from one state to another, from their country of origin where they fear persecution to an alternative where they don't. This is a quantitative transition, as there is a precise point of delineation at which one leaves their country of origin and meets the demands of the first theme. That is, when they cross a border. Past this point, one can claim that they no longer exist in the country of origin, as they now are in another, distinctly different country. Temporal travel, however, is more qualitative than this. There is no single point at which one passes from their original time into another. Periods don't have borders. If a cryon undergoes preservation only to be revived a day later, it would be reasonable to consider them as still residing in their original period. Thus, they would not be a cryonic refugee. But how long does it take for someone to leave their original era? This is another tricky question to answer. Yet, this difficulty does not eliminate the possibility of such drastic temporal travel. I'd say with some confidence that a person who is revived a millennia after preservation would no longer inhabit their period of origin. The reasonably anticipated drastic changes to the world's social structures, political entities, economic systems, ecological processes, and a whole host of other factors would make the cryon's new world categorically different from the one they originated. So, while the fulfillment of Theme 1 is dependent on the length of time traversed, I suggest that a cryon can potentially be considered a refugee relating to them no longer residing in their period of origin. So, theoretically at least, the first criteria can be satisfied. Like criteria 1, criteria 2 requires similar alteration. Rather than considering whether a refugee is unable to return to their country of origin, what is required is an examination of whether a cryon is unable to return to their period of origin. This relies on the presumption that a cryon has indeed left their original period, which we'll make here for expediency's sake. Whether that cryon can return to their original period depends on the technological capabilities they could utilize upon revival. Because the flow of time moves from the past to the future, the only way a cryon could foreseeably return to their period of origin is if they have access to time travel. A cryon who could return to their period of origin would need a method for going against the natural temporal flow. So, barring the invention of time travel then, it would seem reasonable to assert that this isn't possible. Thus, cryonic preservation is a one-way trip. Once the cryon leaves their initial time, it is forever off limits to them. So, criteria 2 is satisfied. The reasoning for why a contemporary refugee leaves their country of origin and is subsequently unable to return is critical to their claim to the title of refugee. For an individual or group to qualify as a refugee, their exodus from their country of origin must be based upon a fear of persecution. This is criteria 3's concern. Making persecution, be that perceived or actual, a necessary component of being a refugee brings with it a distinct challenge. That is, what is defined as persecution is not clarified within the 1951 Convention, nor is there a universally accepted definition. Thus, what an individual may believe to be a legitimate fear of persecution that has led them to flee their country of origin may be, once they arrive in their destined country, considered by that state not actually to be persecution. Thus, there is a problem of vagueness. A potential clarifying point comes courtesy of Article 33 of the 1951 Convention, which, while outlining the prohibition of refoulement, states that no contracting state shall expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. From this, we can reasonably infer that a threat to life resultant from an individual being a member of a particular race, religion, nationality, particular social group, or political opinion is a form of persecution. While there are constraints on how far an understanding can be extended, this interpretation is supported by paragraph 51 of the UNHCR handbook. So, suppose we accept persecution as including a threat to life. In that case, whether a cryon fulfills the requirements of criteria 3 falls upon whether they cannot avail themselves of the protection of their point of origin because of a credible fear of death. Such a fear of death would appear to be appropriate for a cryon, as this is the very reason why those individuals undergo preservation in the first place. They seek a means of circumventing their immediate death by temporally relocating to a society that can provide them with the medical and scientific means of doing so. Thus, if we accept that a fear of death is equivalent to a fear of persecution, which the general refugee-related guidance says we should, then criteria 3 is fulfilled. The final of the 4 criteria concerns the trait which leads individuals to be persecuted. Suppose we continue this understanding of the fear of persecution as tangential to a fear of death. In that case, it is possible to examine criteria 4 in a similar manner to that of criteria 3. So, does a cryon fear a threat of death resulting from a trait linked to their identity in a manner comparable to that of a contemporary refugee? The 5 traits identified by the 1951 Refugee Convention, for which an individual shouldn't be persecuted, are race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, and membership of a particular political opinion. As understood according to the common vernacular, none of these categories overlaps easily with would-be cryons. Those who undergo cryonic preservation are not a homogeneous group that match any of the Convention's criteria. The fear of persecution via death is not born from that individual being a member of a particular race or religion, nationality or political opinion. The fear of death is resultant from the limitations of the medical and scientific knowledge of the period from which that cryon originates. One potential saving grace may come in the stipulation that one can be persecuted because of membership of a particular social group. This form of persecution affords those who experience it the potential of refugee status. Claims relating to sexual orientation, gender, and tribal and clan membership have most often been considered against this category. Like persecution, the term social group is not clearly defined within the 1951 Convention, but the UNHCR Handbook does outline that a social group typically comprises of persons of similar backgrounds, habits, or social status. Furthermore, the UNHCR's Guidelines on International Protection does endorse a definition, stating that a particular social group is a group of persons who share a common characteristic other than their risk of being persecuted, or who are perceived as a group by society. The characteristic will often be one which is intimate, unchangeable, or which is otherwise fundamental to identity, conscience, or the exercise of one's human rights. For a cryonic refugee to satisfy criteria 4, they would need to be identified as a group of persons who share an innate characteristic, which leads them to fear persecution. In other words, it would need to be possible to conceptualize prospective cryons as a unique group of individuals, looking to flee their original temporal zone due to a fear of persecution in the form of death, and seek refuge in the future society, one which can safeguard that person's well-being. While we have a working definition then, this doesn't provide too much guidance on identifying such groups. Luckily, the UNHCR identified two dominant approaches to this task. The first is the social perception approach. According to this method, social groups are those clusters of people viewed by society as separable from the mainstay. Thus, it is the societal perception that affords social group status. This means that some groups, which may seem heterogeneous in some aspect, can be groups according to other relevant factors, for example, working in a particular profession. Whether cryons would be members of a distinct social group is tricky to ascertain. This is because the fear of death is not unique to them, but is something we all face. Thus, arguing that they are in some manner separate from the mainstay of society is a difficult claim to justify, as this fear of death is not exclusive. It may be possible to base such a claim on the presumed immediacy of death which those considering cryonic preservation face, and use this as a method of distinguishing this group from society. However, basing a claim to social group status according to death's proximity is far removed from how social group category has been used in the past. Thus, pursuing this avenue as a means of success is rather uncertain. The second method is the protected characteristics approach. According to this approach, groups can be formed around an intrinsic characteristic that is so fundamental to human dignity that said group should not be forced to sacrifice it. Cryons could be classed together by their desire not to relinquish an aspect of their identity which is fundamental to their human dignity. That is life itself. One could assert that this group is defined by the immediate threat to their lives, and thus by a threat to their inherent human dignity, a threat which could be nullified by transitioning to an alternative period. However, even if this works, there is a restriction to the application of social group status. Specifically, a social group cannot be founded upon the fear of persecution itself. There must be a unifying feature apart from this fear, as the UNHCR makes explicit. Consistent with the language of the Convention, this category cannot be interpreted as a catch-all that applies to all persons fearing persecution. Thus, to preserve the structure and integrity of the Convention's definition of a refugee, a social group cannot be defined exclusively by the fact that it is a target for persecution. Now, this is a problem for any consideration of cryons as a distinct social group. Cryons are not an inherently homogeneous group, but potentially composed of a broad range of individuals. As such, there is nothing relevant beyond their fear of death binding them. So, as a social group cannot be defined solely by their fear of persecution, they equally cannot be defined as a social group because of their fear of imminent death. For a group to be a social group, there needs to be an underlying, binding trait separate from their fear of death, which bonds together those considering cryonic preservation. That is not to say that it will forever be the case. Any definition of a social group is to be understood as alterable. As put by the UNHCR, the term membership of a particular social group should be read in an evolutionary manner, open to the diverse and changing nature of groups in various societies and evolving international human rights norms. What may not be considered a social group at one point in time can, dependent on the way society changes, develop into one. This leaves open the possibility that cryons could be considered a social group as understood according to the 1951 Convention in the future. Where does this leave us then? Is it possible for cryons to be considered analogous with contemporary refugees? The answer is no. While criteria 1 to 3 can be satisfied, the final criteria, which concerns the traits which draws persecution, cannot be fulfilled. This unfulfillment arises because cryons are not persecuted for reasons acceptable by the 1951 Convention. While on the surface cryons may be considered a form of a social group, due to the restrictions placed on this term as outlined in the Guidelines on International Protection, this is ultimately fruitless because a social group cannot be bound solely by their fear of persecution or experience of persecution, or, in this case, their imminent death. That is not to say that the claim that cryons are analogous to contemporary refugees is categorically discredited. On the contrary, alternative definitions, according to which refugees can be understood, may still permit the possibility of one arguing in favour of the existence of the cryonic refugee. However, it is only according to legal definitions from which one can demand protections from a refugee state with jurisprudential backing. And, as the definition currently stands, the cryonic refugee is nothing more than confusing rhetoric. So, that's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, please do. My contact details are on the screen at the moment. Thank you for coming along. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and goodbye.